Hello everyone, I'm the 12th Women's World Chess Champion Alexandra Kostyniuk, and in this video we're gonna talk about bishop or knight versus pawn endgames. In case of a bishop, usually it's quite an easy task for a bishop to stop one pawn. But there are exceptions, as always. Well, those exceptions are quite rare, and I'll start with this rare example where a bishop loses to a pawn. This endgame is from a study. It's white to move, and surprisingly, white wins. Because after king to e4, white stops the bishop from the square e3, where it can stop the pawn, and surprisingly, there is no way this bishop can be in time to stop the a5 pawn. If black plays king e6, then a6, bishop d8, a7 will follow. If black plays bishop h4, trying to stop the pawn from this diagonal, then king f3. And again, it's too bad for this bishop in this particular position. But of course, it's a very rare exception. If we talk about endgames where one knight fights against one pawn, those are quite tricky and complicated. Of course, the more advanced this pawn is, the more dangerous positions are for a knight. If we talk about pawns located on one of these four lines, so central or bishop pawns, in order to make a draw, knight needs to take under control a square in front of such pawns, or if this pawn has already reached the 7th rank, it should be able to take under control from the side the promotional square. Otherwise, the position can be lost. Of course, it depends on the position of the knight's king. But, for example, in this particular situation, if the knight goes to d6 and trying to give a check and take under control the promotional square like this, the position is lost because king d7 follows, knight c4, trying to use this fork trick that we're gonna see quite often in this kind of endgames. But unfortunately for the knight, it doesn't work because king c6, knight e5, king d5, there are no more fork tricks. And then I saw knight d7 and got scared, but in this particular case, c8, queen wins the game. So in order to save the game, the knight should take under control this square from the side. Knight e7 check, that is the correct way to play. And the idea is that after king to d7, knight d5 attacks the pawn, and if the pawn promotes, c8 pawn, c8 queen, knight b6 check, fork, and a draw. After king c6, knight takes c7, also saves the game. That's how the things are against central pawns. If we talk about knight's pawns, the closer the pawn to the side of the board, the more dangerous it is for the knight. So against a 7th rank pawn, the knight should be in front of the pawn, should be able to blockade it. But in this particular situation, we see that white's king stands here, no knight, and thus this position is winning for the pawn. Although it's quite tricky, and in order to win, white needs to play very precisely. For example, king c7 gives only draw because of this wonderful knight d3 move. Sometimes knights are really doing magic. They go away and suddenly they're just in time to save the game. After b7, knight c5 saves the game. Already familiar for us fork trick. b8, queen, knight a6. If the king goes to c6 trying to take control of the c5 square, then knight e5 check. If the king goes to d5, then the knight just in time to go to b8. and thus make a draw. The knight now is in front of the pawn, thus, as we know, the position is drawn. If the king goes to c7, we already had the same position, knight d3, saves the game. So in order to win, white needs to play b7, and white wins. For example, after knight c6, king c7, knight b4, king b6, knight d5, king a5, knight e7, king b5. Very beautiful maneuvering, but it leads white to winning. If black gives check to d7, as we might remember, king to c7 leads just to a draw because of knight c5 and this fork trick. So in order to win, white needs to play king c8, and that's what makes a difference between the knight and the bishop pawn. There is no way for black's knight to go to the left side after the a file, and the position is lost for black. If we move the pawn even further to the side of the board, for the side pawn, the knight draws against a 6th rank rook's pawn if it's in time to get to this safe circle. Only via g4 it saves the game. If it goes to f3, the position is lost because black plays king to g2, knight h4, king f2, and there is no way for this knight to stop this pawn. But if in the starting position white plays knight g4, the knight is just in time and gets in time to this safe circle. King g3, knight e3, after h2, knight f1 follows. In case of king f3, knight f1, and there is no way black can force the knight out of this circle. King g2, knight g4, and so on and so on. In the cases where this knight fights against the pawn, the side pawn that is located on the 7th rank, it cannot save the game without the help of its king. But it can win the time by setting up a very beautiful barrier to the pawn's king. If we look at this position carefully, we will realize that white's king cannot step onto squares d6 or d4 because of this fork, and thus, in order to get to the knight, it needs time to go via f6, but this will give time to black to bring his king closer, and in fact, it's needed to save the game by a very beautiful stalemate. It is the only way to save the game. Another barrier that the knight can build is this one. It's a little bit similar, and again, the white king cannot step to d6 or e7 because of this fork on c8. Thus, it needs more time to get around to the knight, and it gives black also more time to get closer to the c7 square that saves black with this beautiful stalemate. If white's king goes via e5, it also quite long, and thus black has time to save the game. One more position that I wanted to show you, where knight surprisingly saves the game. I just wanted to show you that sometimes, in order to save the game, the knight doesn't need to go closer to the pawn, but in fact it goes very far away, and it's just in time to save it. So this is a very difficult study by Grigoriev. It's why to move, and there is just one move that saves the game, and this move is knight a5. You can try other moves by this knight, but it doesn't make a draw, and this one does. h4, knight c4, king f3, knight e5, and surprisingly, white's knight is just in time to get to this saving circle that we discussed a little bit before. A very beautiful study, but very hard, of course, to find in a practical game. There are rare cases where knights win, but those, of course, are exceptions, usually found in studies Let me demonstrate one study like this. It happens only if the king and the pawn are trapped in the corner. As in this example, the knight goes to b3, king a2, knight c5. The problem for black is that they have only 2 squares and they cannot really move the pawn and try to be stalemated because of this checkmate. And then the knight, doing a circle, goes to c1, taking this only square for the black king under control and thus forcing the pawn to go forward and checkmating. A very beautiful checkmate that can be found in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies. And to finish with, I'm going to show you one practical example, not a study-like example, but that's the endgame of my game from a title Tuesday. I was playing white, and as you can see, I have a knight and my opponent has a side pawn, and we know that side pawns are quite dangerous for the knight. So in order to save this game, I had to find a very beautiful maneuver by the knight and get to this and get to controlling the a2 square. That's actually the rule to remember. Knight needs to take under control one of the squares in front of the pawn, but if it's a side pawn, it should be not later than a2. And I made a very bad move. I played king g5, but after that the knight is just too far away, and after a3, a2, a1, black could have won the game. In fact, they played king b4, and I was able to save the game because my knight suddenly got to this safe circle that we discussed. And I was able to hold on and make a draw by moving my knight around, but in fact, as I said, king g5 is a losing move. And in order to save this position, I had to start moving my knight straight away, knight d7, and jump very fast as I could to this safe circle, to c1, d3, c1, a2, b4, and make a draw like this. So yeah, this is a draw, and I wish for you, if you got